The night I discovered what my son-in-law had been doing, I was standing in my own study, holding a manila folder I wasn't supposed to find. It was a Tuesday in late October. I remember because the heating had just kicked on for the first time that season, and the house smelled like warm dust the way it always does at the start of fall. I'd come in to get my reading glasses. I'd left them on the desk after going over some paperwork that morning, and when I reached past the lamp, my hand knocked a folder off the corner of the desk onto the floor. I picked it up. It wasn't mine. My name was on it, not my handwriting, not my filing. My name, typed neatly on a label, on a folder I had never seen before, sitting in my own study, in my own house, in the home I'd paid off 22 years ago, after 34 years of building alderman construction from 2 trucks and a handshake into one of the most respected mid-size contractors in central Ohio. I stood there a moment with the folder in my hands. The heating clicked and hummed. The dog was asleep somewhere down the hall, and I opened it. Inside was a document I recognized immediately. It was my life insurance policy. But the copy in this folder had annotations on it, small penciled notes in the margins, dates, numbers. A calculation I followed down the page until it landed on the payout figure, $2,400,000. My hand didn't shake. That surprised me later when I thought about it. I was 63 years old in reasonable health, with no reason to believe I was going anywhere soon. But someone had been doing the math on what I was worth dead. I set the folder exactly where I'd found it. Then I went and sat in my car in the garage for 45 minutes, in the dark, with the engine off. Let me back up, because for you to understand what that folder meant, you need to understand what the last few years had looked like. My daughter, my only child, the girl I coached through Little League, even though she wasn't interested, the one who once called me from a gas station in Indiana at 2 in the morning because she'd taken a wrong turn driving back from a friend's and she was scared. She had married a man named Reginald Foss 6 years ago. Reginald. He went by Reggie. He was charming in that specific way that takes you a while to identify. The kind of charm that's always slightly performing. He laughed at things a beat too late. He agreed with you too readily. He remembered details about you. The name of your old dog, where you went to college, in a way that felt less like warmth and more like research. But my daughter loved him. And for a long time, I told myself I was being a suspicious old man. The kind of father-in-law who can't let go. My wife had said as much, gently, over dinner one night about a year into the marriage. You watch him like you're waiting for him to do something wrong, she said. She was right that I watched him. I wasn't sure she was right about the rest. My wife, Rosalind, had passed 3 years before that folder fell off my desk. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. There is nothing I can say about those 11 weeks that doesn't sound like the same things everyone says about losing someone that fast. It hollows you. It leaves rooms in the house that feel different from other rooms. It changes what silence sounds like. After Rosalind died, my daughter and Reggie moved closer. They'd been living in Columbus. They relocated to a suburb about 12 minutes from my house. I told myself it was because she wanted to be near me in my grief, and maybe part of it was. But Reggie had also, around that time, left his sales management job at a medical supply company under circumstances that were vague when I asked about them, and remained vague no matter how many times the subject came up. He started working in real estate. As far as I could tell, this meant he had a license, and occasionally showed houses and spent a great deal of time on his phone. My daughter picked up extra shifts at the dental practice where she worked as an office manager. I helped them out twice, once when they had trouble making rent on the new place, once when their car needed a transmission. I did it without drama, the way my father had always helped me, quietly, because that's what family does. I did not keep score, I did not bring it up at holidays, but I noticed things. Reggie began joining me for breakfast on weekdays. He'd show up around 8, right after my daughter left for work, with some reason or another. He was in the area. He wanted to ask me something about the house. He just thought he'd check in. I liked the company at first. The house had been quiet since Rosalind. Over those breakfasts, he asked a lot of questions. How was the business? Had I thought about what I'd do with the company when I retired? Did I have a financial advisor? Had I updated my will since Rosalind passed? I answered him honestly the first several times. I talked about the business, about my plans, about the estate attorney I'd used for 15 years. I mentioned at some point that I had a substantial life insurance policy because Rosalind and I had taken them out together when my daughter was young, and I'd never had reason to change mine. I thought they were just conversations. I was wrong. About 2 months before I found that folder, something else had happened that I'd filed away without fully understanding. I'd had a medical scare, nothing serious as it turned out, but I'd had some chest tightness during a morning walk and my doctor had sent me for a cardiac workup. I was in the clear, minor arrhythmia manageable with medication, nothing to worry about, but I'd mentioned it to my daughter on the phone, and within 48 hours Reggie had stopped by. Not for breakfast, in the middle of the afternoon, with a bottle of good bourbon, and a look on his face I can only describe now as hopeful. I didn't know that's what it was then. I thought he was concerned. He asked a lot of questions about what the doctors had said. How serious was it? What did the medication do? Had I talked to my attorney about anything? Just making sure you're taken care of, he said, and he smiled the way he always smiled, and I poured us both 2 fingers of the bourbon and told him I was fine. After he left, I stood at the kitchen window for a while. The feeling I had wasn't quite suspicion. It was more like something cold settling in the back of my mind that I didn't yet have a name for. Then the folder fell. I sat in the car in the dark garage and I made a list in my head of everything I knew and everything I didn't. It was the same thing I used to do when I was troubleshooting a problem on a job site, separate what was solid from what was speculation. What I knew, the folder existed. It was in my study, which Reggie had been in before. Often, it contained my life insurance policy with handwritten calculations on it. The calculations were focused on the death benefit. What I didn't know, how long it had been there, whether my daughter knew, that second question was the one that kept me in the car for 45 minutes. I had to consider the possibility that she was part of it. I did not want to consider it. But I am not a man who avoids hard questions, and I sat there in the dark and I made myself look at it straight. She had access to my house. She had a key. She knew my schedule. And she was married to this man. But then I thought about my daughter at 7 years old, sitting across from me at a diner counter, telling me very seriously that she wanted to be a veterinarian, because animals couldn't explain when they were hurting and someone had to pay attention. I thought about her at 17, staying up all night with me in the waiting room, when Rosalind had emergency surgery on her gallbladder. I thought about every version of I'd ever known. I didn't believe she knew. I hoped I was right. And I decided I was going to find out before I did anything else. The first thing I did the next morning was call my attorney, a man named Pickworth who'd handled my legal affairs since I incorporated the business. I did not explain everything on the phone. I said I needed an appointment, that it was about my estate documents, and that I'd prefer it be soon. He fit me in that Friday. I also called a man I'd worked with on a commercial project about 8 years earlier. He'd done security consulting for a client of mine, background checks, that kind of work. I remembered him as careful and discreet. His name was Theodore Baum. I found his number in an old business card file I keep in the bottom desk drawer. I told Theodore I needed to know about a person. I gave him Reggie's full name. I told him I needed to know about his employment history, his finances, and anything in his background that didn't match the version of himself he'd been presenting to me for 6 years. Theodore said, give him 10 days. Then I started paying closer attention. I did not change my behavior. I had breakfast with Reggie the following Tuesday as if nothing had happened. I talked about the weather turning cold, about a project the company was wrapping up in Westerville, about a book I'd been reading. I watched his face the way you watch a gauge, not obvious about it, but steady. He brought up my health twice. Both times casual, easy, the way someone might if they were genuinely just checking in. "You feeling okay? Still taking the medication?" And I said yes, I was fine, and I watched. On the 8th day, I found something else. I'd been more deliberate about going through the study. Not tossing things, not disturbing anything, just being thorough in a way I hadn't been since Rosalind died, and I'd let the room get away from me. In the back of a file drawer, behind a hanging folder labeled Home Warranties, I found a small spiral notebook. It was Reggie's. I knew his handwriting. Inside were 2 pages of notes that I read standing at the filing cabinet with the drawer still open. They were notes about me, about my health, my habits, the medication I'd been prescribed. There was a question written and circled, beneficiary update. There was a phone number I didn't recognize. And there was a date circled, my upcoming birthday in December, with a single word next to it. Timeline. I took photos of every page with my phone. I put the notebook back exactly where I found it. And then I sat down at my desk in my own study, in the home I'd built my life around, and I made myself breathe slowly until my hands were steady. He was planning something. He was timing it, and he thought I had no idea. That was his mistake. Theodore Baum called on day 11 with a voice that told me before he said a word that what he'd found was significant. He went through it methodically. Reggie had not left his sales position at the medical supply company. He'd been terminated following an internal investigation into expense account fraud. It had not resulted in criminal charges because the company had recovered the money and didn't want the publicity, but the record was there if you knew where to look. Before that, in a state he'd lived in briefly before moving to Ohio, there had been a civil lawsuit. A woman, elderly, living alone, had filed a complaint against a home repair company Reggie had operated for 8 months. The complaint alleged that she'd paid $36,000 for work that was either never completed or done in a way that caused additional damage. The case had settled out of court. The company had dissolved 2 months later. There was also a first marriage. 3 years ended in divorce. The ex-wife had filed a protective order at the time of the separation. I sat with all of that for a long time. I went to see Pickworth that afternoon rather than waiting for my scheduled appointment. I brought Theodore's summary. I brought the photos from my phone. I told Pickworth everything, the breakfasts, the questions about the policy, the folder, the notebook, the circled date, the word timeline. Pickworth listened without interrupting. He is a methodical man, not given to dramatic reactions, and the only sign that what I was telling him was as serious as I thought it was came when he put his pen down mid-note and looked at me over his glasses. "Walter." He stopped. "Sorry. Excuse me. You said he had the policy annotated, with the payout figure, with a calculation leading to the payout figure." "Yes." He picked his pen back up. "Okay," he said. "Here's what we're going to do." What we did first was update my estate documents legitimately, something I genuinely needed to do and had been putting off since Rosalind passed. Pickworth changed my beneficiary designations, locked certain assets into a trust structure that would be much harder to access quickly, and documented the entire process with dates. Second, on Pickworth's advice, I made an appointment with the county sheriff's non-emergency line. Not to file a formal complaint yet. We didn't have enough for that, but to begin a record. I spoke to a detective who specialized in financial crimes against elderly victims. She listened carefully. She said what I'd described was consistent with a pattern she'd seen before. She gave me her direct number and told me to call her when I had more. Third, I talked to my daughter. This was the part I had been most afraid of. I asked her to have lunch with me on a Saturday, just the 2 of us, at a diner we used to go to when she was in high school. We ordered coffee and eggs, and I let the conversation run normal for a while. How work was, how she was sleeping, whether she'd talked to her cousin who'd just had a baby. And then I said, carefully, that I needed to ask her something, and I needed her not to react until I finished. She looked at me and said, "Dad, what is it?" I told her about the folder. I told her about the notebook. I told her what Theodore had found. I watched her face the whole time. My daughter went very still the way she used to when she was a child, and something scared her. Her coffee cup stayed on the table halfway to her mouth for a long time. When I finished, she set it down slowly, and I saw her jaw tighten in a way that reminded me, sharply and suddenly, of her mother. "He told me he asked you about the policy because he was worried about me inheriting debt," she said. Her voice was quiet. "He said you had some complicated business liabilities, and he wanted to understand the situation in case something happened to you." I hadn't told her about the liabilities conversation. She was filling in blanks I hadn't given her. "Did you ask him to do that?" I said. She looked at me for a moment. "No," she said, "I didn't." What happened next is not something I'll describe in full because it belongs to her and not to me. What I'll say is that my daughter is not a woman who crumbles, and she didn't. She was angry, and then she was sad, and then she was angry again. And through all of it, she asked careful, specific questions. The same questions I'd asked myself, the same questions Pickworth had asked me. She wasn't protecting him. She was processing. And when she was done processing, she looked across the table at me and said, "What do you need me to do?" I told her. She needed to continue acting normally. She could not let him know she knew, not yet. I understood I was asking her to do something very hard, and I told her so. She nodded once. She understood why. We paid the check and walked to the parking lot, and she hugged me longer than she usually does, and when she pulled back, her eyes were dry. "I've got it," she said, and I believed her. The next 3 weeks were the strangest of my life. I went to breakfast with Reggie. I talked about the business, the weather, a football game I hadn't really watched. I took my medication in front of him once deliberately and watched the flicker of attention in his eyes that he covered immediately with a sip of coffee. He was patient. I had to give him that. He never rushed, never pushed. He was playing a long game, and he thought he had all the time he needed. He didn't know I'd already changed the beneficiary on the policy. He didn't know the account he believed held the bulk of my liquid assets had been restructured. He didn't know Theodore Baum had handed a complete file to the financial crimes detective 3 days after our lunch. And he didn't know that on a Tuesday morning in mid-November, when he arrived at my door for what he thought was breakfast, there were 2 detectives sitting in my living room. I'd made coffee. I'd set out mugs on the counter. When I opened the door and he came in with that easy practice smile, I said good morning and told him to come on through to the kitchen. He walked ahead of me. He rounded the corner into the living room. He stopped. I watched him understand what he was looking at. The smile didn't disappear. It changed. It went from easy to careful in the span of about half a second. The detectives introduced themselves. They asked Reggie if he'd like to sit down. He looked at me. I poured myself a cup of coffee. What followed was not a scene from a movie. There was no shouting. He didn't run. He sat down, and he answered questions in a measured voice that I imagine had served him very well in a number of situations. And then he asked to speak to an attorney, and the conversation ended there. They did not arrest him that morning. The case, Pickworth had explained to me, needed to be built properly to hold. There were elements of criminal attempt and fraud conspiracy that required documentation, and the detective wanted the file complete before charges were filed. What happened that morning was an interview, a formal one with everything it implied. He left my house that morning without looking at me again. The charges came 6 weeks later: fraud, conspiracy, financial elder abuse. Ohio has specific statutes for this, and 2 additional counts connected to the civil complaint Theodore had uncovered in the other state, which had surfaced as part of the investigation. The business about the elderly woman and the home repair company had not, as it turned out, been fully settled in the legal sense. My daughter had filed for divorce the week prior. She moved back into her old room at my house for a month, then found an apartment 20 minutes away. I helped her move. We didn't talk much about Reggie during that time. We talked about paint colors and whether her couch was going to fit through the door and what she wanted from the house she'd shared with him. She took her grandmother's rocking chair, a few kitchen things, and a box of books. She left the furniture. She said she didn't want any of it. On the last day I helped her move, we sat on the floor of her empty new living room eating sandwiches from a deli bag. And she said, "I keep thinking I missed something. I thought about the folder falling off my desk. The way coincidence sometimes moves in your favor when you least expect it." "We all miss things," I said. She looked at the ceiling for a while. "I chose him." "You chose who you thought he was," I said. "That's different." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, how did you know when you found the folder? How did you know right away it wasn't something innocent?" I thought about standing in the study with the folder in my hands, the heating clicking on, the dog down the hall, the way my hand hadn't shaken. "Because I'd been watching him for 6 years, I said, "and some part of me already knew." She didn't say anything. She handed me half of her sandwich. "I've thought a lot since all of this about what gets lost when someone who's supposed to love you turns out to be calculating how long you'll live. There's an anger in it that doesn't go away clean. It sits somewhere below the surface and occasionally surfaces without warning. When I'm driving somewhere ordinary, when I'm in the study where the folder used to be, I don't try to reason it away. I just let it move through and pass. What I've held on to instead is something simpler. I took a morning walk last spring, same route I always take, past the elementary school and around the block with the old oak trees. The arrhythmia has stayed manageable. My doctor is pleased. The medication is easy. I walk at my own pace and I don't rush the uphill stretch the way I used to. My daughter calls most evenings. She got a promotion at the dental practice. She's been taking a pottery class on Thursday nights, and she laughs about how bad she is at it in a way that sounds like she's not thinking about anything else for a few hours, and that makes me glad. The company is doing well. I brought in a project manager who can start taking on more of the day-to-day, and I'm thinking about what the next few years look like. A gradual handoff, some travel, maybe finally going to see the national parks I've been talking about since Rosalind was alive. Reggie pled guilty to 2 of the 4 counts. He's appealing the financial elder abuse charge. His attorney is, apparently, very good. Mine is better. I am 64 years old. My house is quiet in the way that houses are when they've held enough life to feel full without noise. I have a dog, a truck that needs new rear tires, and a daughter who calls. That is plenty. That is, it turns out, more than enough.